Chef Marcus Webb pointed directly at Jonathan Roumie in front of 80 people and said it with a smile so comfortable it made the whole room worse. "We welcome all kinds here, even the kind that turns my dining room into a prayer chapel." Then his son walked out of the kitchen with a plate that cost $380 and poured it, slowly, deliberately, onto Jonathan's jacket. The room laughed. Not nervous laughter, not the embarrassed kind. The genuine, sustained laughter of wealthy people who had just watched something cruel and found it entertaining. Jonathan stood there with sauce dripping from his sleeve. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. And everything that happened after that began in that silence. The Meridian in Midtown Chicago was not the kind of restaurant that needed to advertise. It had been awarded 4 stars by every publication that mattered, booked 14 months in advance, and profiled in enough magazines that its name had become shorthand for a certain kind of dining experience. The kind where the food was genuinely extraordinary and the atmosphere made you feel that being there at all was a privilege you had not fully earned. There were restaurants in Chicago that were better known to the general public and restaurants that were more fashionable in the way that fashion moves through industries. But among people who cooked seriously and ate seriously, the Meridian occupied a specific category of its own. The kind of place you described to people who had not been there by saying simply that you needed to go. Chef Marcus Webb had built it from a single location in River North into a collection of 6 restaurants across 4 cities over 18 years. He had done this through a combination of undeniable culinary talent, obsessive attention to quality, and a management philosophy that he described in interviews as uncompromising standards and that former employees described when they were far enough removed from the industry to feel safe describing it in considerably different terms. He had built an empire, which is the word that kept appearing in profiles of him, and he wore the word with the ease of a man who had never questioned whether the manner of the building was as important as the fact of what had been built. He was 56 years old, trim and silver-haired, with the composed bearing of someone who had spent decades being told he was exceptional and had arranged his entire personality around the assumption that this would continue. He appeared on television occasionally, morning shows, Food Network features, once a long profile piece on a Sunday news magazine. And he was always thoughtful and articulate, always careful to present himself as demanding but passionate rather than the other thing he was, which people inside his industry understood clearly and spoke about quietly when they were among people they trusted and had for reasons of career preservation, never said loudly enough to force the kind of reckoning that loudness sometimes forces. The Meridian's dining room held 80 guests. The tables were set at distances that communicated privacy without isolation, the geometry of a room that understood itself. The lighting had been designed by a firm that specialized in what they called aspirational warmth, which in practice meant amber-toned and flattering, the kind of light that made every person in the room feel they belonged in a painting, or at least that the version of themselves sitting in this particular chair in this particular light was the best available version. The menu changed seasonally, and the wine list ran to 40 pages, and reservations required a non-refundable credit card deposit that generated occasional complaints, and that Webb had maintained across 18 years because it communicated clearly and without apology that his time had a specific value, and that value was not negotiable. Jonathan Roumie had made the reservation 4 months earlier, in a window that opened at midnight on the 1st of September for January bookings. He was in Chicago for 3 days because of a press event connected to his production company, and he had invited 4 colleagues to dinner to celebrate a piece of news that they had been working toward for 2 years and had finally received the previous week. A distribution deal, the kind that changed the scale of what was possible for a production company the size of his. Not a reason for fireworks or speeches, but a reason to sit together over excellent food and acknowledge that something hard had come through and that the people around the table had done something worth doing. The Meridian had been recommended by someone Jonathan trusted. He had not known, taking his seat at table 7 in the second-floor dining room, that he was about to have the most clarifying evening of his adult life. The dinner had started well. The food arrived as advertised, technically flawless and beautifully presented, the kind of cooking that made you slow down and pay attention to each element in the particular way that you pay attention to something that deserves it. They ordered wine. They talked about the distribution deal and what it meant and what they wanted to do with what it made possible. Jonathan looked around the room at the other diners in their evening clothes under the amber lighting and felt the particular contentment of being somewhere excellent on an evening that deserved it. He had eaten in many excellent restaurants and had learned to hold the pleasure of it lightly, to appreciate it without requiring it. That evening he simply felt glad to be there. Then he bowed his head, not for long, perhaps 8 seconds, perhaps 10. A private, silent moment of thanks before the meal. His lips did not move. He made no sound. He simply sat with his eyes closed and his hands loosely folded for the length of time it takes to say something briefly and mean it completely. The kind of moment that, in most rooms, would be entirely invisible because there was nothing to see. The kind of moment that belonged entirely to the person having it, requiring nothing from anyone else in the room, claiming nothing from the space around it. The server who brought the appetizers noticed. Someone else noticed the server noticing. By the time Jonathan lifted his head, word had traveled through some channel of kitchen floor communication that operated at the speed of a room that was being managed by someone who wanted to know everything that happened in it. Marcus Webb crossed the dining room in the specific way of someone who owns the floor they are walking on and is aware, in every step, of the effect that ownership produces on the people they are walking toward. He stopped beside table 7 and looked at Jonathan with an expression that was almost friendly, the kind of expression that contains its opposite if you have learned to read it. "I hope you're enjoying the meal," he said. His voice was measured and carried the specific warmth of a host in a room he owns. Then, pitched just a fraction louder, just enough to reach the adjacent tables. "We welcome all kinds here, even the kind that turns my dining room into a prayer chapel." The nearby tables went still, not silent. There was still the ambient sound of the restaurant operating around them, glasses and low voices, and the distant organization of the kitchen. But the specific, attentive stillness of people who have registered that something is happening and have made the unconscious decision to observe it rather than return to their own conversations. Jonathan looked up at him. "I'm sorry." Webb tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man who has been misunderstood before and is about to generously clarify. "You were praying. I saw you. We have a culture here built around the experience of the food, not around personal religious performances. This is a dining room, not a chapel. If you want to pray, there are places designed for that. This isn't one of them." Jonathan's colleague across the table, a producer named Sarah who had been with the production company since the beginning, started to say something. Jonathan held up one hand, not aggressively, just a quiet signal, and she stopped. "I wasn't performing anything," Jonathan said. "I said a private thank you before eating. I didn't think it affected anyone else in the room." "It affects the atmosphere," Webb said. "It affects the message this restaurant sends about what we are." He paused, and something in his expression changed slightly, a quality of decision, as if he had been considering the polite version of what he wanted to say and had decided against it. "I'll be direct. I've spent 30 years building a restaurant that operates on the idea that excellence is enough, that we don't need mythology or ritual or the comfort of invisible beings keeping watch. We have craft. We have discipline. We have standards that require total commitment to the real and the measurable. When someone comes in here and bows their head to pray, it isn't neutral. It's a statement about what they believe is missing from what we've created. And I find that statement offensive." The tables around them were fully quiet now. Jonathan was aware of being watched and of choosing, in real time, how to carry himself inside that awareness. "I wasn't making a statement about your restaurant," he said. "I was making a private gesture of gratitude. In my dining room, at my table, Webb regarded him for a moment with the patience of a man who is accustomed to having disagreements end in his favor. Then, with the practiced ease of someone whose last word has always been the last word, enjoy your meal. But please keep your personal rituals personal. He turned to go, and that was when the kitchen door opened. The boy who came through it was 17, with his father's sharp features and the specific certainty of expression that only develops in people who have never been seriously challenged by anything in their lives. He was carrying a plate of wagyu beef with black truffle cream that had been composed with obvious skill and care and was worth $380 by the menu price. The composition was precise. The plating showed hours of practice. Someone had put real attention into that dish, and that person was not the boy now carrying it across the dining room toward table 7. He walked directly to the table. He appended the plate onto the tablecloth in front of Jonathan. The beef slid. The truffle cream spread across the white linen and onto the sleeve of Jonathan's jacket. A small arrangement of vegetables scattered across the table. The sound it made was quiet, which somehow made it worse than a loud sound would have been. The boy stepped back with a half-smile that he had clearly rehearsed in some interior way. The smile of someone delivering a punchline they are completely confident about. "Careful," he said. "Didn't want to interrupt your prayer." The room erupted. Not every table. Perhaps a third of the diners laughed openly, immediately, without hesitation. Another third looked uncomfortable and said nothing, doing the quiet calculation of people who know what they witnessed was wrong and are deciding whether the social cost of saying so is one they are willing to pay. The remaining third, quietly and without announcement, did not laugh at all. But the laughter that did come was real, and it lasted long enough to fill the room with something specific, and phones appeared, recording from multiple angles, the modern reflex of witnessing something and immediately reaching to extend its life for an audience that was not present. Jonathan stood there in the middle of it with sauce on his jacket, and the particular sensation of being made into a spectacle in a room that was actively enjoying being the audience for that spectacle. Marcus Webb, standing near the kitchen door, did not intervene. He watched his son walk back into the kitchen with the satisfaction of someone watching a plan execute correctly. Jonathan picked up a napkin and blotted his sleeve. He did this slowly and thoroughly, which had the effect of giving the room time to complete what it was doing without requiring him to perform impatience or distress for its benefit. When the laughter had subsided into something more uncertain, when the room had remembered that it was watching a real person and not a character, he set the napkin down and stood. He looked at Marcus Webb directly. "I came here tonight to celebrate with people I care about," he said. His voice was even. It took something to keep it that way, and he was aware of that cost and paid it. "I came to eat food made by someone with obvious talent. Instead, I learned something about you that no amount of talent can make worth respecting." He paused, a beat that the room felt. "I was going to announce something tonight. My production company has been in conversation about a partnership with your restaurant group. $35 million over 3 years to create a series of dining experiences connected to our programming. Accessible, excellent, and open to every kind of person who wants to sit down for a good meal. I was going to offer that to you tonight because your food deserved it." He straightened his jacket. "I won't be doing that." He left money on the table for the wine. He and his 4 colleagues walked out through a dining room that had gone completely quiet, through 80 people who watched them go and who would most of them be unable to explain later exactly why the exit felt more significant than the scene that had preceded it. The room felt different after they left, as if something had been removed from it that it had not known was there. Outside on Michigan Avenue, the November air was sharp and clean after the engineered warmth of the dining room. The 5 of them stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not quite ready to start walking, the way you stand when something has just happened that you are still processing. "We are going to make sure that never happens to anyone else," Jonathan said. He did not yet know how precise that statement would turn out to be. Her name was Carol Reyes, and she had spent 17 years inside Marcus Webb's kitchen. She had started at the original River North location as a line cook at 26, talented and committed and willing to work the kind of hours the industry demanded of people who wanted to be taken seriously. She had been raised by a mother who cooked seriously, who understood the kitchen as a place where care and skill produced something that was more than fuel, and a grandmother who had told her, more than once, that feeding people was one of the most direct forms of love available to anyone. She had carried that understanding into a career that she had chosen deliberately and worked at without reservation. She had learned her craft under Webb's demanding eye, had absorbed everything he had to teach about technique and flavor and the way a dish could communicate something beyond its ingredients. She was, by the assessment of everyone who worked alongside her over 17 years, one of the most gifted cooks in any of his 6 kitchens. Webb knew this. He had told her so, in the specific terms that he used to tell people things like that, which was to say he had acknowledged it in ways that communicated she was valuable without quite acknowledging that she was irreplaceable, because irreplaceable was a word he reserved for the version of the kitchen where he remained the only thing that could not be substituted. She had also spent 17 years watching, not passively, watching the way that people watch when they're cataloging something, when they understand at some level, not always consciously, that what they're seeing will eventually matter and that someone needs to be keeping the record. She had started a notebook in her 3rd year, after watching a dishwasher from Guatemala be told by a manager that if he reported the burn on his forearm to anyone outside the kitchen, he would find himself on a flight home before the end of the week. She had watched the dishwasher's face as he processed what that meant. She had gone to her car at the end of the shift and written it down. The date, the names, the specific language that had been used, the expression on the dishwasher's face that she was not going to let herself forget. Then she had started a 2nd notebook for a different category of incident, then a 3rd. Then, when the notebooks became insufficient for the volume of what she was recording, she had moved to digital files organized by location and date and category and name, cross-referenced and backed up in 2 places, built with the methodical attention of someone who understood from the beginning that the difference between a story and evidence was specificity and that evidence required a level of care that stories did not. 17 years, 6 original notebooks, and then files, organized and complete. 3,400 documented incidents. She had been fired 6 months before Jonathan Roumie walked into the Meridian. The stated reason was performance, which was false and demonstrably so by any objective review of her record. The actual reason was that she had told a junior cook, a 22-year-old woman who had been there for 7 months, that the harassment she was experiencing from a senior sous chef should be documented and brought formally to Carol, who would take it through the proper channels. The sous chef had found out through a 3rd party. Marcus Webb had been told and had made his calculation, which was the same calculation he always made. The sous chef had been with him 11 years and produced excellent work, and his loyalty was established. And the junior cook was new, and her departure would be managed, and the matter would be handled in the way that such matters were always handled in his kitchens, which was to make them disappear. Carol had been walked out on a Tuesday morning with a box of personal belongings and a severance check that her attorney later described as structured specifically to discourage legal action by appearing more generous than it actually was. She had spent 6 months thinking about what to do with 3,400 documented incidents, and then she saw the video. The video had been shot on 3 different phones simultaneously and uploaded within 40 minutes of Jonathan leaving the restaurant. It showed the plate being upended and the boy stepping back with his smile and the room laughing. And it showed Jonathan standing very still, blotting his jacket with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has decided not to give the room any more than it had already taken. The clip that most people watched repeatedly was not the plate being poured, but the moment after, when Jonathan straightened and said something to Marcus Webb that the audio captured only partially, and the room went silent around it in a way that communicated more than the words did. The video went, as certain videos go, immediately and extensively and seemingly irreversibly viral. By midnight, it had been viewed 11 million times. By the following morning, 60 million. By the end of the week, it had been covered in 43 countries and had become, in the compressed way of these things, a kind of symbol for a set of feelings that a large number of people had been carrying for a long time without a specific occasion to attach them to. Carol watched the video and recognized, with the particular clarity of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and suddenly sees it arrive, that her 6 months of uncertainty were over. She called Jonathan's production company at 8 on a Wednesday morning and asked, with more directness than she had expected from herself, to speak with whoever made decisions about important things. After 2 transfers, she reached a man named David Park, who described himself as Jonathan's attorney and business partner, and who listened to her explain who she was and what she had, methodically and without embellishment, for 4 minutes without interrupting. "Can you send me a summary?" he asked. "I can send you 3,400 documented incidents with dates, names, and corroborating evidence," she said. "I can send you 17 years of financial records showing wage theft affecting 41 workers across 4 cities. I can send you records of bribes paid to health inspectors in 4 cities, totaling $22 million over 14 years. I can send you tax documentation showing $160 million hidden in offshore accounts through shell companies. And I can send you testimony from 19 women who were harassed or assaulted by Webb or members of his senior staff, each with supporting evidence, including recorded messages, email correspondence, and corroborating witness statements." The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds. "Send it tonight," David said. "All of it." Carol sent it at 11:17. The files were large enough that it took 40 minutes. She ate dinner while she waited for the upload to complete. It was the first meal she had prepared for herself with something approaching actual pleasure in 6 months. Jonathan spent 2 full days reading the files, not skimming them, not delegating the reading to someone who would summarize the important parts, but reading carefully and in sequence, following the documentation the way you follow a map through territory that keeps revealing itself to be larger and more complicated than you initially understood. He read with a legal pad beside him, making notes in the margins of printed sections, writing questions that required answers before anything moved forward. The wage theft records were detailed enough that a forensic accountant could build a federal criminal case from them without supplementary investigation. Carol had copied payroll records and placed them beside the applicable federal and state wage requirements for each location, creating a comparison that required nothing except arithmetic to understand. What workers were paid versus what the law required they be paid. The discrepancy across 4 cities and 18 years totaled $9.3 million. The workers affected were mostly immigrants, mostly undocumented, and have been told explicitly by management, in some cases with enough directness that Carol had recorded the specific language, that complaints about wages or conditions would be handled through immigration enforcement rather than labor law. Several of them had made the calculation that $9.3 million stolen from them collectively was survivable in a way that deportation was not, and had stayed silent and continued working, and the theft had continued. The health inspection records were a different kind of evidence and a different kind of disturbing. 14 years of bribery in 4 cities. Webb had maintained relationships with inspectors in Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and Nashville, paying them quarterly through intermediaries and cash arrangements that Carol had traced through the financial records she had quietly copied over years of access to corporate files. The violations that had been buried included a fire suppression system in the Nashville kitchen that had been inoperable for 2 full years and cited twice, and resolved both times through payment rather than repair. There were refrigeration failures in Philadelphia that had resulted in food being served outside safe temperature ranges for documented periods. There was a rodent situation in the Chicago prep kitchen that 3 separate inspectors had documented and that had been addressed in the record through payments that the inspectors had subsequently noted as resolved without any physical remediation. The testimony from 19 women was the hardest to read, and Jonathan read every word. 19 separate accounts, written at different times by different women who had worked in different cities in different years, producing a pattern of such consistency that attributing it to coincidence required a theory considerably more elaborate than the obvious explanation. Young women hired for entry-level positions, senior staff communicating, in terms that ranged from oblique to explicit, that advancement in Webb's kitchens operated on a relationship model that required a specific kind of relationship. Women who declined, performance managed out, some quickly, some over months, but reliably, without exception. Women who complied, used and then discarded and then blacklisted, their careers ended before they had fully begun. In an industry where Webb's endorsement was one of the most valuable things a young cook or server could possess, which meant that his active disapproval was one of the most damaging. Several women had filed formal complaints through internal channels. Carol had documentation of all of them. Not one had resulted in action. By the end of the second day, Jonathan understood two things. The first was that what had happened to him in the Meridian dining room was minor. Not nothing, not something to be dismissed, but minor in a way that mattered enormously to how he was going to think about everything that followed. Minor compared to 18 years of systematic harm to workers who had no platform and no audience and no recourse and no ability to simply leave without losing livelihoods they could not afford to lose. The second was that this stopped now. He called David Park. "I want a press conference with Carol present. I want everything independently verified before we say a single word publicly. 3 attorneys and 2 forensic accountants minimum. Not people in our network, independent review. And I want every worker whose wages were stolen and every woman in those files to have independent legal representation in place before anything goes public. Their protection comes first. Not the story. Their protection." David was quiet for a moment. "That's going to take at least 4 weeks. Then we take 4 weeks." They took 4. The press conference was held on a cold December morning in the ballroom of a hotel in downtown Chicago, 3 blocks from the Meridian. Jonathan stood at a podium flanked by David Park and Carol Reyes. Behind them, projected on a large screen, were photographs. Not of Marcus Webb, not of his restaurants, but of people. Workers whose wages had been stolen and who had consented to the use of their photographs. Women whose careers had been damaged and who had chosen to be identified. Former employees who had been fired for refusing to participate in various aspects of what had been built around them. The decision about whose photographs appeared had been made entirely by those people, with independent counsel and without pressure from Jonathan's side. Jonathan's statement lasted 11 minutes. It was specific, documented, and contained nothing that had not already been verified by the independent reviewers. Carol spoke for 9 minutes after him. She was not a practiced public speaker and did not try to become one in the space of those 9 minutes. She described what she had seen over 17 years in the measured language of someone who has been organizing information for a long time and understands the difference between what is useful and what is not. She described the first notebook, the dishwasher from Guatemala, and the burn on his forearm, and the drive home afterward, and the decision she made sitting in her car that she was going to write it down. She described 17 years of writing things down while the industry around her operated on the assumption that what happened in Marcus Webb's kitchens was governed by the same logic as what happened in every other celebrated kitchen. That demanding excellence produced collateral damage, and that collateral damage was the cost of the excellence, and that the cost was acceptable. She described why she had come to believe that it was not. The questions from reporters were sharp and sometimes skeptical. Jonathan and Carol and David answered all of them. They had prepared for skepticism. They had expected it. What they had was better than argument. They had documentation, and documentation is its own answer to most questions about credibility. What they had not anticipated was the response that happened 5 hours later. Marcus Webb held his own press conference at the Meridian, standing in his kitchen in his white chef's coat in front of cameras he had arranged himself. He described Carol Reyes as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge for a termination she had not deserved. He characterized Jonathan as a religious celebrity manufacturing controversy for the benefit of his television career. He called the documentation fabricated and the testimony coordinated and the federal investigations politically motivated. He was calm and articulate and credible in the way that people with resources and practice public presence can be credible regardless of whether what they're saying is true. But 3 of the reporters present had already seen Carol's files. 2 of them asked him directly about specific incidents, naming dates and workers and details that could not have been guessed or fabricated. Webb answered the first 2 questions with maintained composure. The third question, from a reporter who read verbatim from an email in which Webb had instructed a manager to tell a worker reporting a workplace injury to deal with it quietly or deal with the consequences, produced an answer that became defensive in a way that cameras captured completely, and that defensiveness, more than anything else said that day, became the clip that played on every broadcast that evening and into the following morning. 6 federal agencies opened formal investigations within 72 hours. 3 of Webb's restaurants were closed by health departments within the first week, pending inspections that proceeded with a thoroughness that previous inspections had not. The Chicago location passed its inspection but was placed under ongoing monitoring. Investors began withdrawing from Webb's restaurant group with the carefully worded statements of people who have decided that association with something is more costly than the investment they are walking away from. The television network that had been developing a cooking program around Webb canceled production with a statement that said very little about why. His book publisher paused the release of his forthcoming cookbook pending review of the situation. The James Beard Foundation issued a careful statement about reviewing its previous recognition of his work. Webb held 2 more press conferences over the following weeks, each attended by fewer reporters and generating less coverage than the one before. His legal team was excellent and ultimately facing a problem that excellence cannot solve, which is that 3,400 documented incidents do not respond to reframing. Tyler Webb watched all of this from his dormitory at a private school in Connecticut. He was 17 years old and had spent his entire life in the specific gravity of being Marcus Webb's son, which produced a particular kind of confidence. Not earned confidence, not confidence built through testing yourself against things that might refuse you, but the confidence of someone who has been located inside a system that arranges itself around certain people and has never had reason to wonder whether the arrangement was appropriate or whether it would hold. He had grown up watching his father manage rooms and people and situations with total authority and had absorbed the lessons so thoroughly, so early, that it had become invisible to him, the way the deepest lessons become invisible. That authority was the natural condition of exceptional people, and that the people the authority was exercised over were, by the logic of the exercise, less exceptional. The video of Tyler pouring the plate had been viewed 60 million times. His acceptance to Georgetown had been rescinded, the university citing character concerns in a letter that was formal and brief. His girlfriend, who had known him since 8th grade and who he had assumed would be part of his future in the uncomplicated way that certain assumptions about the future embed themselves, sent him a text message that was 7 words long. 3 of his closest friends had stopped responding to his messages with a progressiveness that communicated decision rather than distraction. He sat in his room in Connecticut and watched the coverage and the testimony and the convictions accumulating and understood, with the specific nausea of a person whose entire structural understanding of the world is being dismantled, that his father had not been what Tyler had understood him to be. He flew to Chicago on a Friday and took a car to the production company office on North Wacker. He went to the reception desk and said he was there to see Jonathan Roumie. The receptionist looked at him and recognized him and said she would see if Mr. Roumie was available. He sat in the lobby for 40 minutes. He did not check his phone. He sat with his coat still on and a bag at his feet and waited. Jonathan came down himself. Tyler looked younger in person than in the video. He was sitting in a chair near the entrance with the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy long enough that setting it down has become physically necessary, regardless of whether the person receiving it is ready for it. "I know you don't owe me anything," he said. "I know I have no right to be here. I just need to say to your face rather than through a statement my lawyer wrote." He stopped for a moment to find the exact language. What I did was wrong. Not wrong as in against the rules. Wrong as in I looked at a person and decided that what I found contemptible about him was more real than he was. My father taught me to do that. He taught me that people who need to pray are people who haven't developed the strength to face reality without comfort, that they're weak. That weakness is contemptible. That showing contempt for weakness is honest. He paused. I believed him. He was my father. "I am sorry." Jonathan sat in the chair across from him. He did not respond immediately. He looked at Tyler with the specific attention of someone who is trying to see a person accurately rather than through the frame they arrived with. "Your father taught you that," Jonathan said. "That's true. And at 17, your entire framework for understanding people was built by someone who was building it wrong. That doesn't mean you walk away from what you did without facing what it was. But it does mean that what you did doesn't have to be the final word on what you are." "What would it take?" Tyler asked. Jonathan thought for a moment. "Testify. Tell federal investigators everything you saw growing up and everything you were taught, and how the contempt in your father's restaurants was not accidental or individual, but instructed and systematic, because that mattered for the case, and because saying it out loud to people who need to hear it is different from just knowing it privately. Then spend the next several years in conditions that are the opposite of what you grew up in. Do work that requires you to serve people rather than rank them, and do it without maintaining a mental account of how much credit you are accumulating. Because the moment you start tracking the credit, the work stops being what it needs to be." He paused. "Not because it redeems you, because it might, over time, make you into someone actually different, which is the only version of redemption that means anything." Tyler looked at him with the careful hope of someone who has learned recently to be suspicious of offers that seem too clean. "I don't know how to be that person," he said. "Nobody does at 17. Jonathan said. "That's the point of the work." The trial began on a gray February morning at the federal courthouse on South Dearborn. The charges were 17 counts spanning tax evasion, wire fraud, labor trafficking, bribery of public officials, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The prosecution presented their case over 3 weeks with the methodical precision of a team that understood its case was built on documentation rather than argument, and that the documentation was sufficient. The workers testified. They testified with the flat, careful specificity of people describing things that happened to them rather than performing distress about things that happened to them. And this quality of flatness was counterintuitively more persuasive than drama would have been. Miguel Fernandez, who had worked the prep kitchen of the Nashville location for 6 years and whose wages had been stolen across all 6 of those years, held up his pay stubs beside the federal wage requirements and let the arithmetic do what arithmetic does. He was a small man in his 40s who had driven from Nashville with his sister to testify, and when he was released from the stand, he did not leave the gallery. He stayed for the rest of that day's proceedings as if he needed to be present for the full length of what his testimony had been part of. The women testified, some in person, several through recorded statements, because the prospect of being in the same room as Marcus Webb was a cost they had decided they could not pay. The 19 accounts, given without coordination across different years and different locations, produced a pattern of such consistency that attributing it to coincidence would have required a theory more complex than the obvious one. The defense attempted several such theories. None of them survived cross-examination. Tyler testified on the 4th day of the 2nd week. He was 18 years old by then. He sat in the witness chair and answered every question directly, including the questions that reflected worst on him and on his father. He described the plate incident not as an impulsive act, but as something his father had suggested to him earlier in the service. When word reached him through the floor staff that a customer was praying before his meal at table 7. He described watching his father instruct a manager, when Tyler was 12 years old, to tell a worker who had reported a workplace injury to handle it privately or face the consequences. He described the specific philosophy his father had built around contempt for religious faith, not as a vague attitude, but as a fully articulated position that Webb had shared with Tyler repeatedly and explicitly over years of Tyler's formation, framed as insight rather than opinion, as the honest view of a man sophisticated enough to see things as they were. He did not cry during his testimony. He answered every question with the flat honesty of someone who has decided that this is the form of atonement available to him and who is not going to reduce it through performance. The verdict came after 9 hours of jury deliberation. Guilty on 16 of 17 counts. The 17th count was dismissed on a technical procedural ground that both sides had anticipated as a possibility and that affected neither the overall conviction nor the sentence. Sentencing: 10 years in a federal facility, no parole eligibility for 6, $28 million in restitution to be distributed among the workers who had been stolen from and the women whose careers had been damaged. Webb's personal assets were ordered liquidated. All 6 restaurant locations were permanently closed. His name was removed from the awards and publications that had celebrated it, voluntarily and without prompting, by the organizations that had given those recognitions. Marcus Webb was led out of the courtroom. He did not look back at the gallery where Carol Reyes sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her face carrying the composed expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has arrived at the end of the patience. Carol spent the 6 months following the verdict building something. The building that had housed the Meridian's River North location was a beautiful space in the way that emptied spaces can be beautiful when the history they hold has finally been accounted for. Exposed brick and 18-foot ceilings and south-facing windows that let in substantial afternoon light. Jonathan had identified it after the liquidation of Webb's assets, made it available at a rate that reflected the specific difficulty of finding a tenant for a space with that recent history attached to it. He had shown Carol photographs without telling her what he was thinking, letting her arrive at her own reading of them. She had been quiet for a long moment after seeing the photographs. "I want the kitchen visible," she said. "Not behind glass as a design feature. Actually visible, so that people who come here can see who is making their food and understand that those people are the point of the restaurant, not the backdrop for it. I want the menu to reflect what this city actually is," Jonathan said. "Not what a certain kind of customer expects fine dining to look like." They spent 4 months building it, with Carol as lead and Jonathan as partner, and a rotating group of former Webb employees who had been willing to come back together for this. Because the people who understood most precisely what had been wrong in those kitchens were also the people who understood best what needed to be different. The workers who had testified helped design the compensation structure, which was built from the assumption that fair wages were not a gesture toward fairness, but the actual point. Miguel Fernandez moved from Nashville to Chicago and became the kitchen's first head of logistics. Patricia Owens, who had been harassed and fired from the Philadelphia location 6 years earlier, and who had eventually found her way back into cooking at a small catering company, where she was appreciated in proportion to what she actually contributed, became one of Carol's sous chefs. They named it Commonwealth, not a word with specific culinary associations, but a word that meant something about the idea underneath what they were building, that it was shared, that it belonged to the people who made it and the people who came to it in equal measure, that it was not the private empire of one man's ego, but a common project in the truest possible sense of that phrase. They opened on a Wednesday evening in September, exactly 10 months after the plate had been poured onto Jonathan's jacket. The first reservation had been given, at Carol's insistence, to Miguel Fernandez and his sister. They sat at a corner table and ate a meal that Carol had constructed with some reference to the flavors of Nashville and some reference to the city where Miguel had grown up before Nashville, And when he finished, he sat for a long moment with his hand flat on the tablecloth. His sister touched his arm. He looked at her, and then at the kitchen visible through the glass, and at the room around him that had been built by people who understood what his presence there actually meant. The second reservation went to Ruth Watkins from the Evanston Food Bank, where Tyler had done his community service, and her 7-year-old granddaughter. The granddaughter bowed her head before eating, eyes closed, lips moving slightly. No one in the restaurant said anything. The server refilled their water glasses and moved to the next table. The granddaughter opened her eyes and began eating her soup with the focused pleasure of someone encountering something good for the first time. The Commonwealth Fund, Carol's renaming of the Hospitality Dignity Fund that Jonathan had established with initial funding after the trial, spent its first year doing specific things. Intervening in 27 cases of wage theft across Chicago and 3 surrounding cities. Recovering over $1.5 million for workers who had been stolen from and who had previously believed that recovering it was not possible. Establishing a tip line that received over 200 contacts monthly from workers and customers who had experienced abuse and had, until then, operated under the reasonable assumption that there was nowhere to take it. Tyler Webb completed his community service and enrolled in a culinary program at a city college on the north side. He was the youngest student in his cohort by several years. He was also the only one whose name was recognizable from a video viewed 60 million times, which produced in his classmates a range of responses: suspicion, reluctance, in a few cases something like cautious curiosity about whether the person in front of them was the same as the person in the video. Tyler understood all of these responses. He did not try to manage them. He showed up every day. He did the work. By the 6th week, most of his cohort had arrived at a pragmatic peace based on the evidence of his consistency, which is the only form of evidence available to people whose previous evidence is a video of their worst moment. He wrote to Jonathan through Carol's office at the end of his first semester, not asking for anything legible. In a letter that Carol read before passing it on, he wrote, "I want to work at Commonwealth when I have the skills to be useful. Not as a gesture and not as an attempt at something I understand is not on offer. Because the restaurant is doing something real and I want to be part of something real. I will wait until you think I am ready and I will accept whatever role makes sense and I will not make either of you regret the decision." Carol and Jonathan talked about the letter for a week. Carol sent a 2-sentence reply. "Finish the program. Come talk to us in June." He finished. He came in June. He started in the prep kitchen the following week, washing produce and breaking down proteins and learning from the first stage of food preparation what it meant to contribute to something from the beginning rather than appearing at the point where the contribution becomes visible. He worked in prep for 4 months before Carol moved him to line work. He worked line for 3 months before she began teaching him what it meant to think about a dish from its origin rather than execute it from its middle. He was not the most talented cook in the kitchen. Carol would not have said he was in the top half yet, but he was reliable and teachable, and he had developed through the discipline of being wrong regularly and responding to that without the defensive collapse that had characterized his earlier life, a quality that was different from talent. He had learned that correction was information and not judgment. He had learned it from people who owed him nothing, and he had learned it completely. In the winter of a year following Commonwealth's opening, a letter arrived at the production company's office on North Wacker. It was handwritten on institutional stationery from a federal correctional facility in Indiana. Marcus Webb had lost weight. The photograph on the institutional envelope showed someone who had been reduced in a way that was not only physical, the specific reduction that comes from having the architecture of one's self-conception removed by force and having to continue existing without it. The letter was 4 pages, written in his even practiced hand. He did not ask for anything. Not appeal support, not public advocacy, not even a reply. He was writing because he had been attending a discussion group at the facility led by a chaplain, which he had joined initially because it provided something to do on Tuesday evenings and which had become, over the months since he joined it, something he had not anticipated and could not fully describe. The group's approach was simple and not theoretical. If you have harmed people, the first honest act available to you is to name the harm specifically and directly to the person you harmed, or as close to them as you can reach. Acknowledgement was not forgiveness and did not require it. It was simply the naming of what had been done, without the negotiation of context, and without the management of how you appear while doing it. He wrote about Carol, about what he understood now, sitting in a room with no authority and no kitchen and no industry to operate inside, about what it had actually cost her to document what she documented across 17 years. He wrote about the specific people whose names he had learned during the trial. He wrote about what he now understood to be the difference between what he had told himself he was doing and what he had actually been doing to people who came to his restaurants or worked in them or tried to build careers inside them. He wrote about Tyler, about teaching a boy cruelty and calling it sophistication and the specific responsibility of that. He did not defend it. He described it. He did not write about Jonathan until the final page. What I did in the dining room that night was not impulsive, he wrote. I had been doing versions of it for 20 years, and I had built a philosophy around it, which made it worse because a philosophy requires you to believe yourself rather than simply acting badly without thinking. I taught Tyler the philosophy. I taught it to him before he was old enough to ask where the lessons were coming from or whether they were right. A visible pause in the letter, a space. Then, you didn't retaliate. You said what you were taking back, and you walked out. I've thought about that more than about almost anything else since the trial. Because the thing my entire identity was built on was being someone who could not be quietly dismissed. And you dismissed me quietly and left. I'm beginning to understand what that says about the difference between your self-conception and mine. The letter ended without resolution. No arc toward redeemed wisdom. No claim that suffering had produced insight that made the years of harm meaningful. Just a man, reduced, practicing the specific act of naming what he had done to specific people, because someone had told him it was the only honest thing still available to him. And he was discovering, for the first time in his adult life, what it felt like to care about honesty more than about how he appeared. Jonathan thought about the letter for several days before responding. His response was one page. He wrote that he accepted the letter as what it was, acknowledgement and not apology, because apology implies a relationship between the parties, and they did not have one. He wrote that Tyler was in a kitchen in Chicago, working prep, learning from the beginning what it meant to contribute to something rather than perform within it. And that Webb should know this because the boy's future was not fixed, and what he was doing with his days now was genuinely different from what he had been doing when Webb was teaching him who to become. He wrote that Carol Reyes had built something protecting workers and customers in ways that Webb's 18 years of celebrated excellence had never managed, and that it was built partly on the documentation of his crimes, which meant that the harm he had caused was being converted, not with comfort attached, not with any narrative that made the harm acceptable, into systems that prevented it from continuing. He wrote, at the end, "The meal I came to your restaurant for was a celebration. I had good news and people I cared about and food that was, by every account I had received, made beautifully. I wanted to say thank you before I ate it. 10 seconds. I have spent a significant amount of time thinking about what it means that 10 seconds of private gratitude was enough to set all of this in motion. I think it means that the capacity to feel genuine thanks for something as ordinary as a good meal with people you care about is one of the things that keeps a person honest about what actually matters, about what the work is for and who it belongs to. You might spend some time thinking about that." He sent the letter and returned to the other work of the day. Commonwealth marked its first anniversary on a September evening warm enough to open the front windows onto the sidewalk. The dining room held 90 people. Carol stood at the pass calling orders in the visible kitchen, while the room outside had held a cross-section of the city that the Meridian, for all its excellence, had never held. Not by explicit policy, but by the cumulative effect of a culture that communicated consistently and clearly which people were welcome and which were welcome as long as they performed welcome in the specific way the room expected. Tyler was working the fish station. He had been at Commonwealth for 4 months and had stopped being watched with the particular attention you give someone whose reliability you have not yet established. That quality of attention had been replaced by the ordinary attention Carol gave everyone in her kitchen, which was the same for everyone, which was what he had been working toward without knowing that was the measure. Patricia Owens called something across to him about the timing on a butter sauce. Correction in the efficient shorthand of a kitchen where people had learned to trust each other's judgment enough to say what needed to be said directly. Tyler adjusted without looking up. Patricia moved on to the next thing. This was what it looked like when a culture had been built from the beginning by people who understood the difference between demanding excellence and demanding submission, between standards that raised everyone and standards that simply identified who could absorb the most damage without breaking. Jonathan arrived near closing time and found Carol in the kitchen after service had ended and the last customers had gone. "Full every night this week," she said. "There's serious interest in a second location." Carol was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone thinking something through. "Before we expand, I need to be certain that what we have here is actually what we think it is, not just what it looks like from the outside." She looked around her kitchen. Webb's restaurant looked right from the outside for 18 years. "We should talk to the staff, not management. The people in the prep kitchen and the dishwashing stations. We ask them what they actually experience working here. We listen to what they actually say. And if they tell us something we don't want to hear, we hear it," Jonathan said. "We hear it," she said, "and we change whatever needs to change. Because the moment we stop being willing to hear it, we become the version of this that we were trying to build against." They stood in the kitchen for a while, the way you stand in something you built when you're still not entirely sure it will hold. Outside, Chicago continued. The city carried its millions forward through a September night that had no particular interest in what was happening inside any specific building on any specific block. Inside Commonwealth, the kitchen was clean. The prep lists for tomorrow's service were written on the board in Carol's handwriting. The schedule on the wall showed everyone their hours, and every hour would be paid at the rate printed beside it, because Carol had made that non-negotiable on the first day and had not been asked to renegotiate it since. It was not perfect. Nothing built by people ever is. There would be failures, imperfections, moments where the principles were compromised by the pressures of operating a real restaurant in a real city and then corrected, because correction was the practice rather than the exception. But it was honest, and it was trying every day to stay that way. And in the specific world that Carol Reyes had spent 17 years documenting from the inside, honesty was not the baseline. It was the achievement, the thing you built toward, not the thing you started with. 10 seconds of private gratitude before a meal had exposed 18 years of systematic harm. What you built from that exposure was a choice. It was always a choice. And the choice, made consistently every day by imperfect people who understood what they were building against. That was the work. That was all of it. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you. The Evanston Food Bank, where Tyler served his community service hours, occupied a converted warehouse on Green Bay Road, 2 blocks from the elevated train line. The building rattled slightly each time a train passed, which happened often enough that the staff had stopped noticing it, and the volunteers noticed it for the first week, and then stopped noticing it too. The interior was organized with the particular efficiency of a space that needed to process large volumes of donated goods and distribute them to people who needed them, and where every square foot had been assigned a purpose and was held to that purpose. Tyler arrived for his first shift on a Monday morning in March wearing clothes that had been chosen without any conscious thought about what was appropriate for the context, which meant they had been chosen with habits that no longer applied. A jacket that had cost more than the monthly salary of several people he would be working alongside that day. Shoes that were conspicuous in the specific way of expensive things among people who cannot afford expensive things. Donna Harris, who ran the facility and had been running it for 22 years, looked at him when he came through the door and said nothing about the clothes because saying something about the clothes on the first day would have produced self-consciousness rather than learning, and self-consciousness was not useful. She assigned him to boxing produce, not because the task was menial or because she was making a point. She assigned everyone to produce boxing on their first shift because it required nothing except attention and patience and the willingness to do the same thing repeatedly without variation. And those were the qualities she needed to see before she assigned anyone to tasks that required judgment. Tyler spent 4 hours that first Monday putting apples and sweet potatoes and onions into boxes. He did it correctly with the care of someone who is aware of being observed and is responding to the awareness. Donna watched him from the corner of her eye, the way she watched everyone, and noted the awareness and the response to it, and waited to see whether the awareness would fade or whether it would remain a performance indefinitely. By the third week, it had faded. He was doing the work rather than performing the work. Donna noted this without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement at that stage would have redirected his attention back to himself. The clients who came to the food bank on Tuesdays and Thursdays were a cross-section of people whose circumstances had brought them to the point of needing what the food bank provided. Some of them were temporarily in difficulty. Some of them had been in difficulty for years. A few of them recognized Tyler from a video and watched him from a careful distance, making their own assessments. Most of them were focused on what they had come for and paid him no more attention than they paid anyone else in the building who was moving boxes and filling orders. Ruth Watkins came on Tuesdays. She was 63 years old and had been coming for 2 years and had established the particular low-key regularity of a long-term client who has made peace with the fact of her need without having made peace with the conditions that produced it. She raised her granddaughter, who was 7, on a fixed income that covered the necessities with an efficiency that required constant management. The food bank reduced the management burden by a margin that mattered. She and Tyler exchanged a few words on the first Tuesday. He was there. A few more on the second. By the fourth Tuesday, they had developed the habit of a brief conversation while he helped load her bags. The easy, casual talk of people who have decided to be cordial to each other without quite deciding yet whether they will be more than that. She knew who he was. She had seen the video. On the fifth Tuesday, she said to him, without preamble and with the directness of someone who has decided to use the time she is rather than build up to a thing slowly. You poured food on a man because he prayed before eating. Yes, Tyler said. What was wrong with you? He thought about it for long enough that she could see he was actually thinking rather than reaching for the prepared answer. I was taught that needing to pray was evidence of weakness. That people who had to believe in something larger than themselves were people who hadn't developed the strength to face the world on its own terms. My father believed this very completely, and he taught it to me very early. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She was loading a bag with the practiced economy of someone who has done this many times. And you believed him because he was your father. I believed him because he was my father and because nothing in my life had given me a reason not to, Tyler said. I had never been in a situation where the belief was tested against anything real. Ruth nodded slowly. My granddaughter prays every night before she goes to sleep. She started doing it on her own at 5 years old. I don't know where she got it from. I'm not a particularly religious person. But she decided at 5 that there was something worth being grateful to and something worth asking for help from. I don't know if she's right about the theology, but I know that the moments she spends with her eyes closed every night before sleep are the most serious moments of her day, the most intentional. She paused. Anyone who looked at that and saw weakness would just be wrong. That's all. Not evil and not sophisticated and not honest. Just wrong. Tyler finished loading the bag and handed it to her. I know, he said. It was not a concession or a performance of agreement. It was a statement about something he had come to understand through a process that was still underway. Ruth took the bag. Good, she said. Keep knowing it. She came back the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that, and each time they talked for a few minutes, and the conversations gradually became less careful. The way conversations between people who have been honest with each other early on sometimes become less careful as they accumulate. She told him about her granddaughter in the specific terms of a grandmother who found the child genuinely interesting rather than simply loved. He told her over several Tuesdays about growing up inside his father's restaurants and the specific things he had been taught there and what he was doing now about having been taught them. She did not tell him it was enough. She did not tell him he was forgiven because that was not something she had to offer him, and she understood this clearly. What she offered him was the continued fact of her presence and the conversations that came with it, which was itself a form of generosity that he was learning to recognize as such. One Tuesday, near the end of his community service hours, he brought her granddaughter a small book about cooking for children that he had found at a used bookshop near the culinary school. Ruth looked at the book and then at him with an expression that was evaluating rather than warm, the expression of someone deciding what the gesture meant. She's going to love this, Ruth said finally. I thought she might, Tyler said, since she prays before meals. Seemed like maybe she'd be interested in what goes into them. Ruth put the book in her bag. You're different than you were the first day you showed up here, she said. Still got a lot of work to do, but different. Tyler looked at the produce boxes, waiting to be filled. I know, he said. That's what I'm here for. The expansion conversation between Jonathan and Carol happened over several months, spread across dinners and walks and phone calls that accumulated into a decision neither of them made quickly. The question was not whether to expand. The question was whether the thing they had built in River North was transferable, whether Commonwealth was a set of principles that could be carried into a second space, a third, more, or whether it was something that only worked because of the specific people who had built it and who were present in it every day and whose presence was the thing rather than an expression of something more abstract. Carol had seen enough of what happened to restaurant groups that expanded too quickly and lost the thing that had made the original worth expanding. She had watched it happen from inside Marcus Webb's empire, had watched the culture of each new location approximate the culture of the previous one, while losing something specific and unnameable that only revealed itself in the gap between what the restaurant claimed to be and what it actually was when you were inside it. She was not going to do that. She spent 3 months interviewing the full staff of Commonwealth. Not the management, but every person in the kitchen and on the floor, from the sous chefs to the prep cooks to the servers to the dishwashers, and asking them what their experience of working there actually was. Not whether they were satisfied in the human resources sense, but what it was actually like on an ordinary Tuesday during service and after service, and at 4 in the morning doing prep, and at the end of a week where everything had gone wrong at once. She asked them what the kitchen felt like. She asked them what they would change if they had the authority to change it. She asked them what they were afraid to say to her, and then waited to see whether they would say it. Some of them were. Some things came out of those conversations that Carol had not known and that required changes to how certain things were done. Not dramatic changes, but the kind of specific adjustments that only become visible when you're actually asking rather than assuming. She took the results of the interviews to Jonathan not as a report, but as a working document. Things they had done right, things that needed to change before any expansion happened, things that might scale and things that probably would not and would require different solutions in different spaces. Before we open a second location, she told him, I want to spend 6 months implementing everything on this list. And then we do the interviews again. And if the interviews come back better, we consider the second location. And we do the same process for that location before we consider a third. Jonathan looked at the document. That's slow. Yes, Carol said. It is. That's the point, Jonathan said. That's the point, Carol confirmed. They began implementing the changes. Some of them were logistical, scheduling adjustments that gave kitchen staff more predictability, equipment replacements that had been deferred in the early months and that Carol had noted in the interviews were sources of frustration. Some of them were cultural, formalized protocols for how concerns were raised and addressed, because the informal culture of directness that Carol had intended to build required structure to be consistent rather than dependent on her individual presence. Tyler, working his fish station and moving slowly toward the competence that Carol was watching for without announcing she was watching for it, was part of one of those conversations. He was asked, as everyone was asked, what he would change if he could change something. He thought for a long moment. There are people on the floor who don't know the people in the kitchen, he said. I think if they knew each other better, like actually knew each other, not just by role, the service would be better and the experience of working here would be better. Because right now the kitchen and the floor are polite to each other, but they're not really on the same team yet. They're just doing adjacent jobs in the same building. Carol wrote this down. She implemented a monthly shared meal, the full staff, kitchen, and floor together, eating food that the kitchen prepared specifically for the occasion, and that was different from the menu, food that the cook chose because they wanted to make it rather than because the restaurant required it. The meal lasted 2 hours and was paid time. The effect on the working relationships between kitchen and floor was visible within 2 months. Tyler did not know this was a direct result of what he had said in his interview. Carol did not tell him, because the work was the point, not the credit for the work. In the second year of Commonwealth's operation, Carol was invited to speak at a conference for independent restaurant owners in Indianapolis. The conference was organized around the question of whether ethical operation and financial success were compatible in fine dining, a question that had been treated in most industry discussions as rhetorical, with the implicit understanding that the answer was no, that the pressures of the industry required compromises that ethics couldn't survive at the level where real success lived. Carol's answer, delivered to a room of 200 restaurant owners and operators, was not rhetorical. She described what she had built and how she had built it and what the first 2 years of operation had produced in terms that were financial before they were moral, because she understood that the room needed the financial argument before it would receive the moral one. Commonwealth had operated at a higher labor cost than most comparable fine dining establishments. Its wage structure, its benefits, its commitment to paid time for the monthly shared meals, and for training that went beyond technique into the culture of the kitchen. All of this cost more than the industry standard, which had evolved toward the assumption that low labor costs were a necessary component of profitability at the level where quality dining lived. Commonwealth's revenue in its second year was 40% higher than its first. Its staff turnover rate was 4%, against an industry average of 73%. Its food cost percentage was 2 points lower than industry standard, because workers who were treated with dignity and paid fairly took less from the kitchen and wasted less, and cared more about what happened to the ingredients between delivery and plate. Its customer return rate was the highest Carol had ever seen at any establishment she had worked in, including the Meridian in its most successful years. She put these numbers on the screen behind her. The industry has a story about why excellence requires exploitation, she said. The story says that the standards that produce exceptional food can only be maintained through pressure. That pressure requires fear. That fear requires the power differential that comes from underpaying people who have no alternatives. I spent 17 years inside that story. I documented what it actually produced. She paused. These numbers are the alternative story. The one the industry doesn't want to believe, because believing it would require changing everything about how it operates. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something has been said that cannot be easily processed and disagreed with simultaneously. A man near the back raised his hand. He had been running a restaurant in Indianapolis for 20 years, successful enough to be at a conference like this, but not successful enough to be certain the success would continue. He asked how she had made the transition, how you built a culture like Commonwealth's when everything you had learned about the industry pointed the other way. You hire people who have been failed by the previous culture, Carol said. And then you listen to them. Not perform listening. Actually listen in a way where what they tell you changes what you do. She looked at the room. Most restaurant owners I've met are good at performing listening. They're terrible at the actual thing. Because the actual thing requires you to accept that you don't already know, and accepting that you don't already know is one of the hardest things for people who have built their identity around knowing. She told them about the interviews, about the monthly shared meals that had come from one of those interviews, about the equipment replacements and the scheduling changes and the dozens of small adjustments that had come from deciding that the people doing the work were the primary source of information about how to do the work better. She did not tell them it was easy. She told them it was worth it, which was a different thing. She flew back to Chicago and went directly from the airport to the restaurant, arriving in time to see the kitchen in its closing routine, the familiar choreography of a well-run kitchen at the end of service. Tyler was breaking down his station with the methodical care that Carol had come to expect from him. Patricia was on the other side of the line, doing the same. The kitchen was loud with the specific noise of cleanup, water, and movement, and the particular banter of people who had just done something hard together and were now on the other side of it. Carol stood at the entrance to the kitchen for a moment before anyone saw her, watching. This was what she had spent 17 years documenting the absence of. Not the technical excellence of the food, which had always existed in the kitchen she worked in, but the specific quality of a room where people were doing difficult work and were not afraid of the room they were doing it in. Miguel looked up and saw her and nodded. Patricia waved. Tyler turned around and said, "How was Indianapolis?" And Carol said, "Good." They listened. And Tyler said, "Did it help?" And Carol thought for a moment and said, "I think so. Some of them. The ones who were ready to hear it." She hung up her coat and went to her office to write the notes from the conference while they were still clear. The kitchen cleaned itself around her as she wrote, and the sounds of it came through the office wall, and she sat inside those sounds and wrote about what she had built and why it had worked and what it required of the people who built it, which was not primarily talent or strategy, but the specific willingness to keep asking rather than assuming, to keep listening rather than concluding, to accept that the work was not done when the numbers were good, but only when the people doing it confirmed, through their own words in their own time, that the space was actually what it claimed to be. It was a high standard. It was the right standard. And it was, as she had told the room in Indianapolis, worth it.